February 8th, 2023, that morning we were getting ready for our own chapel right here in Estes Chapel at Asbury Theological Seminary. Wednesday is the one day a week that we have chapel on the same day as Asbury University. And we began our day by praying together. So what I remember about that morning is, for some reason, in that pre-service prayer time, I felt led to share with the students and faculty and staff gathered who were going to lead the service a verse that I felt God had led me to that morning in my prayer time. And it was from John 8, Jesus addressing the woman at the well, where he says that God is seeking worshipers to worship him in spirit and in truth. And for some reason, that just really stood out to me that day. People were texting me left and right. I remember being kind of annoyed. Why is my text message going off all of this time? And it was friends, students, some of them at Asbury University, some students here at the seminary, friends who worked at the university, all letting me know that Asbury University's chapel had not ended. And after a while, certain students were letting me know, I'm going over, come on over. By the time I got to my last meeting of the day, my vice president, Matt Barnes, said, why don't we just go? And I came back over to my building to get my things together and leave. And our security guard was coming in for the night. And he said, this is about 4:30, where is everybody? This place is really emptied out. What we didn't know is a lot of the seminary had already crossed the street into Hughes Auditorium at Asbury University. And by the time I made my way over there, there was just a sweet time of worship happening. The room was not full by any means. It felt in that large space like a very intimate group. In reality, it was a couple of hundred or more. And I knew so many faces in the room, groups of university students praying with each other. A lot of our seminary students were there praying in groups. And you just sensed a sweet spirit of God when you walked in the place. It felt calming, almost like a spiritual weighted blanket on you. You could sense the peace and just the feeling of God's presence in that room. This was just something that was happening and ongoing and unfolding. And as I went home for the night to take care of my family, I kept getting texts from seminary students, people at the university, that things were ongoing and happening. And for the rest of the week, that seemed to be about the speed. This was something happening within our community and really for and from the students that had begun in prayer at the altar at Asbury University. That Sunday, I was sitting in church that morning when I received another text message. It was from my friend Sarah Baldwin, who's a vice president at Asbury University. And she said to me, Hughes Auditorium is full, which first of all was just very difficult for me to imagine. Hughes Auditorium is full. This was on a Sunday. And we are going to need Estes Chapel. We need your help. I said yes to Sarah, whatever you need from us. And we began calling and texting staff members at the seminary to see if on a weekend we could open our chapel space, have our restrooms ready, be ready with worship on this side of the street. And so we opened it and began, and it was a beautiful night. People were standing in line to get into Hughes Auditorium. There wasn't enough space in that multiple thousand seat auditorium. And so we were receiving the overflow here in Estes Chapel. And at the end of that night and that time of worship, I texted Sarah and I said, Estes Chapel had about 170 people in it tonight. It was a beautiful time. And she texted back after long days of leading and helping steer things in Hughes Auditorium. I'm going to read what she said to me because I just remember she said, we were at capacity, but what a sweet time of worship. She said, thank you, friend. I feel like we have, quote, the Asbury Outpouring. And what she meant by that is the two Asburys were both stepping up to receive this. And then she said, how about tomorrow? And people were still coming. The cars were just streaming into town. And so on Monday, we began opening Estes Chapel again, and it filled. It was overflowing, it was overflowing. And we opened McKenna Chapel, which is our second chapel. And then a few days later, we needed to actually open our gym in addition. So we ended up with 3 spaces filled with people worshiping Jesus. Each of these spaces, the minute you walked in, you felt the weight of the presence of God. People were streaming to the altar or the space we set up at the front of our gym that became an altar. There was a prayer team in each room. Oh my goodness, the prayers that were pouring out from people, the prayers that people were requesting, there were some weighty things being lifted up to God. We heard stories of physical healings happening in these spaces, people who walked in with a prayer request about something in their body that was broken and who left realizing, you know what, something has changed. So many stories about people who came in with spiritual and emotional needs and received prayer or sat in a pew and left, again, realizing something is different. God has lifted this burden from me. But that sense of, what is this that people are so attracted to? And I think, our generation approaches things with skepticism at first. But I heard again and again from our seminary students, other people, once they got in the room, they said, this is real. And then one day I looked out and I couldn't really discern the difference between our campuses. There was that many people. They had spilled out onto the lawn of Hughes Auditorium coming towards us. They were covering outside of Estes because they were in line to get into Estes as well. The road between our campuses, which is a pretty small road anyway, had pedestrians crossing it almost all the time. Really, I don't think we even stopped to think about it at the time, but this is Asbury Seminary's 100th birthday, and we were actually birthed out of Asbury University. One thing that had been happening was a committee of people meeting throughout probably 18 months to plan a joint worship service between the campuses that was scheduled for April. We were planning on shutting down that road and having worship in the street, a joint worship service between Asbury University and Asbury Seminary. That was still in the planning stages when all of this was going on. But what that meant is that we had a team formed between our campuses of our chapel team, their chapel team, our communications folks matched up with their communications folks, our media staff meeting and getting to know their media staff, and so on and so forth. And all that team building that had been going on, we thought it was for April. We thought we were planning for one worship service. But suddenly we were all moved into action, working with one another at this February outpouring. When I looked out and saw just the crowd stretching from one campus to another, I remember walking through the crowd one day and seeing that, we had all these donations that had showed up. Somebody had to send porta potties because who could even bring all those people inside to use the bathroom? There were stations set up for warmth. There was a trailer that was from the Salvation Army, and it said Salvation Army Crisis Response, and they were handing out pizza. And of course, in Little Wilmore, Kentucky, how do you feed all these people? But the food was actually pouring in donations. But I saw that sign that said Crisis Response, and it occurred to me, wait a minute, this is a crisis, but this is a good crisis. I didn't know you could have a good crisis. And in Wesleyan theology, which is what we do here at the seminary, you talk about this pattern in people's lives of crisis and then process, and then crisis and process, that we have sort of mountaintop experiences and then we process that. Mountaintop experiences, Wesley acknowledged that for us. And it seemed to me that's what we were doing. We were stewarding people not only through the moment, the really 10 days or a little over 2 weeks that we experienced together, but we were stewarding people for the process as well. I heard Dr. Tennant say in our chapel one day during the outpouring that this was sort of a miracle happening to us, and everything was sped up, right? Healings were occurring, epiphanies were happening to people. People were receiving healing in their marriages. There were callings that people were receiving. It was really like a fast forward of what God does on a daily basis. But then he referred to what we do at the seminary as more of a slow motion miracle, that the miracle of theological education and communities gathered for education, both at the university and the seminary, it's like a slow motion unfolding of God's work in our lives. And that made a lot of sense to me, that God doesn't just work in these mountaintop moments, but God works in a beautiful and sustained way over time. So people ask me, how are things different? What did God do that sustained? And I would say we are definitely still processing what happened in February of 2023. Here we are a year later. There's so much more hunger and curiosity. There's times of sustained prayer. There's groups that meet and pray and ask for God to do what only God can do, because now we realize you can make plans all you want. You can pray for revival, but it really takes you by surprise every time. So I think we find ourselves a little more open to God's surprises and a little more ready to receive what God brings that maybe wasn't on our schedule. And we're finding that in the everyday moments, in the home, not just in the honeymoon. We're finding what God is doing still, and we're thankful. I will never forget being part of the Asbury Outpouring and the gift that God gave us and is still giving us through that time that we spent together in worship.